All right, let's go back to our three problems here. Actually, you could go forward. Let's go back to our three problems. The assumptions of normality. What is the norm? What is the norm? And then the power dynamic. And this is going to be extremely critical for us to talk about, as well as the colorblindness. We want to try to tackle this in the next 10 minutes and then open it up for question. Let's talk about normality. The problem with normality is that we assume that there is a normative normalness within Christianity, and everything else is on the periphery of that norm. So the example that I often use is when we talk about theology, for example, we very rarely use the term Western theology, at least in our seminaries. We don't say, what we're about to say to you is a Western theology. We just say, here is theology, or orthodox theology. This is the theology that is the norm because we don't have an adjectival description ahead of that. So it is the normal theology. That's the assumption when you talk about Western theology. But what we do end up doing is giving little adjectives before anything else that's not Western theology. So now we've got black theology because it's theology for black folk. But it's not normal theology, because you've got to qualify this theology as black theology. You've got to call it Minjung theology, because that's the theology for Korean folk. Or you got to call it feminist theology. Or you got to call it liberation theology. And we come up with all of these things, and the assumptions behind that nomenclature is here is the normative theology in the center. Western theology, Calvin, Luther, those guys. That's normal theology. We don't need to give a funny name to that. But the second you start labeling this theology as black theology, liberation theology, you've pushed this theology to the margins and created what I would say the opposite of normality, which is the sense of otherness. You are other. You are not a part of the mainstream. You are not part of the norm. You are on the fringes. And the sociologist, I forgot what discipline he is, the academic that has really talked about this is a guy named Edward Said. Said wrote a book. Let's jump ahead to that. I did not a sequence. All right, let's jump ahead. We don't have time for this. This is really cool too. But next time, next year, we'll do this. This is like the coolest thing. Yeah, just scan all the way through. It's with graphics and everything. I'll explain it next year. Go all the way through. Actually, okay, there we go. I'll come back to it if we have time for those, because those are really cool slides. The assumption of normality and the sense of otherness. Edward Said, who was a Palestinian, taught at Columbia University for many, many years, writes a book called Orientalism. And in it, he's not talking about Orientalism in terms of East Asian culture. He's talking about Orientalism mainly in terms of Middle Eastern culture. Now, he wrote this book back in the 70s. And this is before we saw the Arabic community and the Arabic people as the extreme enemy that we oftentimes conceive of the Arabic people now. I mean, let's be real. That's how American society has portrayed the Arabic community as the enemy of the state, right? I mean, they're the ones that did 9/11. They're the ones who were fighting in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So there's this portrayal of the Arab and the Arabic community as the enemy, and portrayed as the enemy, and the identification of Arabs in airport lines. And so you identify visually, you identify within the culture who is the enemy. Now this is very interesting because that wasn't quite the case 40 years ago. I mean, there was always this kind of otherness to them, but not to the extreme that we have now, which is interesting to me because Said saw this 50 years ago, 40, 50 years ago. He saw this coming. Here's how he saw this. He said that Western culture creates this sense of otherness for the Arabic community and say, you are not like us. You are different from us. And there was this exoticizing of the Arabic culture to the point that you marginalized the Arabic culture. Now listen to that phrasing again. You exoticize a culture in order to marginalize that culture. And you see this quite often in the media. Is that not what we've done with hip-hop culture? We've exoticized that culture and marginalize that culture. Is that what we do with gang thug life culture? We exoticize that culture, and then we marginalize that culture. We do that with this Orientalism in the East Asian community, where you exoticize the Oriental, and then you marginalize it. Let me give you a quote from Said. Said says, this is a long quote, I'm going to have to read it from here. Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient. Again, in this case, he's talking more specifically about Middle Eastern culture. Dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views about it, describing it, teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism is a Western style of dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. European culture gained in strength and gains its identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self. Creation of the other. By the way, if any of you are television fans like I am, who are the bad guys in Lost? The others. Why? Because we don't know them. They are different from us. We marginalize them. And and who knows how this is going to play out. Better turn out well, because I've invested 7 years of my life in the show. But there's this undercurrent of they're saying, no, we're actually the good guys. But why can't you accept that? Because you are the other. Now, it's interesting that one of the Arabic characters, what's his name? Saeed, isn't that great? Yeah, they do all sorts of stuff with their names. Anyway, if you're not into Lost, you have no idea what I just said. What Saeed is saying is, by identifying and setting this group apart, you exert your power over it. And by saying, I am white, by not being black, you have marginalized blacks. I am white because I am not Asian, or I am American because I am not Arabic. Isn't that the thing now? We are Americans. Originally it was we are Americans because we're white, because we're not black. We're Americans because we're not Asian, we're not Chinese, so we will exclude the Chinese from immigrating to the United States. We're Americans because at least we're not Mexicans, and they're here illegally, so we will marginalize that community and create an otherness and give them a name like illegal, when a human being is not illegal. That's poor word usage. It's grammatically incorrect to call a human being illegal. It's just, you don't do that. It's just stupid to use that language for a human being. It's just not done. But when you do that, what have you done? You have identified and marginalized the Mexican community or other immigrant communities as illegal. And now we are American as long as we're not immigrants. We are American as long as we're not Arabs. And that's the way we have operated on this sense of otherness. So what does it mean to create the other? Let's go to the next slide there. There is an interesting book by Ian Haney Lopez called White by Law. And it traces the history of how Americans were defined by whiteness. So if you wanted to be an American citizen, you had to be white. And the categorizing of white became this completely random exercise. And it really has to do with this sense of other. So in 1922, a Japanese American by the name of Ozawa applies for citizenship. And he says, look at my skin color. I am whiter than most white people. So common sense should tell you that I am a white person. So let me be white by law, and therefore I can become an American citizen. In fact, he talks about, look, I was born here in the United States. I'm of Japanese descent. My wife is white. Our children are biracial. I converted to Christianity. I lived the life of an American. You need to accept me as an American, as a white person. The Supreme Court knocked it down and said, scientifically speaking, you don't come from the group of people that we determine as white people. The next case was a guy named Bat Singh. And in this case, he was actually from the Caucasus Mountains. He was Indian, but he was from the Caucasus Mountains. He traced his roots. I am Caucasian, because scientifically speaking, I am from the Caucasus Mountains. And so that was his argument. Now, as an Indian, South Asian, he was dark. He was dark. And the Supreme Court said, no, you're not white, because common sense tells us when I look at you, you're not white. So the Supreme Court goes back and forth, and these cases were, what is it, I think 18 months apart from each other, within a couple of years of each other. They just reversed themselves and arbitrarily decided this person is not white, this person is not white, and they used different criteria to determine who was white and who was not white. So what you're seeing there is the creation of normality. This is the norm. Whiteness is the norm. And we decide who is the other and who is the marginalized.